Her touch meant death. She learned that early in life when the first person she ever touched collapsed before her eyes. It was a cold, winter evening, and her fingers barely brushed against the neighbor's son as they played in the snow. He fell silent, his lips turning pale as his breath froze inside him. By the time help arrived, he was gone. The doctors said it was sudden cardiac arrest caused by the cold. But she knew better. It was her touch. She had only been 6 at the time, too young to fully grasp the weight of what had happened, but old enough to remember every horrifying detail. That was the beginning. It happened again, and again. Teachers, friends, even strangers, anyone who made contact with her skin met the same frozen fate. No one connected the pattern. It was always explained away: freak accidents, undiagnosed heart conditions, or strange environmental factors. But she knew it was her, every single time. By the time she reached her teenage years, she lived in a bubble of isolation. No handshakes, no hugs, no accidental bumps in crowded hallways. She wore gloves year-round, no matter the weather. She refused to join any sports or social activities that required physical contact. If someone tried to touch her, she recoiled like they were made of fire. The rumors started. Some called her weird. Others thought she was just cold and unfriendly. The more unkind ones suggested she was cursed, though none of them believed it literally. But she didn't care what they thought. It was better this way, safer for everyone. Her family noticed but had no explanation. Doctors found nothing wrong. Therapists tried to help her cope with the isolation, but they couldn't fix the underlying problem. No one could. Her life became a cycle of caution and loneliness. College was no different. She lived alone, studied online whenever possible, and avoided social events. She had accepted that this was her life. She would live it carefully, quietly, and alone. There were worse fates, she told herself. At least she could still exist, even if it meant existing at a distance. Then, one day, everything changed. It was an ordinary afternoon. She had just finished grocery shopping when a man in the store tripped near her. His bag spilled across the floor, apples rolling in all directions. Out of reflex, she reached down to help him before she remembered herself. But it was too late. Her gloved hand closed around his wrist to steady him. For a second, she froze. The cold should have surged from her fingertips, spreading through his body like it always did. He should have collapsed. She waited for it, the inevitable gasp, the eyes widening in panic, the sudden stillness. But nothing happened. He looked at her, smiled, and said, "Thanks for the help." His voice was calm, his expression warm. She let go quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. She stepped back, waiting for him to feel it, for the cold to take him. But he just bent down to pick up his groceries, completely unaffected. She watched him, stunned, barely able to breathe. He didn't notice her shock, or if he did, he assumed it was something else. He gave her a nod of thanks and walked away. She stood there for a long time, her mind racing. What had just happened? Why hadn't he frozen? For years, her touch had meant death. There had been no exceptions, until now. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and cautious hope. She returned to the store at the same time every day, hoping to see him again. She needed answers. Was it a fluke? Or was there something different about him? On the third day, she saw him. He was in the produce section, inspecting a bag of oranges. Her heart leapt into her throat. She approached him slowly, her hands trembling. When he noticed her, he smiled again. This time, she removed her glove deliberately. Her bare hand reached out and touched his. It was warm. He didn't pull away. He didn't freeze. The cold never came. For the first time in her life, someone's touch didn't bring death. His hand was solid, real, and alive in hers. She didn't understand why, but in that moment, it didn't matter. He looked down at their hands, then back at her, his brow furrowed slightly, sensing something significant but not knowing what it was. She pulled her hand back and gave a small, almost nervous smile. Then she turned and walked away before he could ask any questions. She didn't sleep that night. Her mind was too busy racing with possibilities. He was different, special. Something about him had broken the curse she'd lived with for so long. The next day, she returned to the store. This time, she wasn't afraid. She touched him again, just a brief brush against his arm as they spoke. Still, nothing happened. The cold didn't come. She found reasons to see him again and again. Their conversations grew longer. His warmth became something she looked forward to, something she craved after a lifetime of cold isolation. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by fear. Weeks turned into months. They spent more time together, and with each passing day, her confidence grew. Slowly, cautiously, she began to live, not just exist, but truly live. He never knew what his touch had done for her, how it had changed everything. He simply became a part of her life, steady and warm, the one person who could touch her without fear. And for her, that was enough. Finally, she was free. She had always known there was something wrong with her body. It started when she was a child. The first time it happened, she was 6. Her family lived in a small, cold apartment, where she would spend most of her time alone, trying to stay warm under heavy blankets. One day, her mother asked her to bring the cat inside. The cat was old and slow, and as she reached down to pick it up, it let out a sharp yowl. Seconds later, it went stiff and cold in her hands. She shook it, confused. Its body stayed frozen, dead. Her mother was horrified, but they never spoke about it again. It kept happening. Birds she tried to feed, plants she touched too long. Even the neighbor's dog once, all lifeless within seconds if her skin made contact with them for more than a moment. She learned to hide it. She wore gloves at all times. Even in summer, when anyone asked why, she'd say she had bad circulation, that her hands were always cold. People believed her. They had no reason not to. As she grew older, she became careful, almost paranoid. She avoided physical contact at all costs. No handshakes, no hugs, no accidental brushing of arms in crowded places. She lived in isolation, watching the world from a distance, silently envying how easily other people touched and laughed and lived without fear. Doctors couldn't explain it. She had gone to dozens of them over the years, secretly hoping one might have an answer. They ran tests, took blood samples, and scanned every inch of her body. Everything came back normal. "Your body temperature is perfectly fine," one doctor said with a shrug. "You're healthy as far as we can tell." But she wasn't. She knew she wasn't. Then one day, she met him. It wasn't a romantic meeting, nothing like the movies. She was at a coffee shop, sitting alone in a corner, staring out the window like she always did. He sat at the table next to hers, tall, scruffy beard, dark eyes. He didn't seem remarkable at first. He was just another face in the crowd. But then she noticed something strange. He was watching her, not in a creepy way, but with a curious expression, like he recognized her from somewhere. She turned back to her coffee, hoping he would stop. He didn't. Eventually, he spoke. "You always sit in the same spot." She froze. She wasn't used to strangers talking to her. I've seen you here before, he said, gesturing around the cafe. You come here often, don't you? She nodded slowly but said nothing. He smiled and returned to his own coffee, not pushing for more conversation. Over the next few weeks, they kept running into each other. He would always sit at the table next to hers, offering a polite nod or a friendly smile. He seemed harmless enough, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the usual panic around someone new. One day, as she reached for her cup, her glove snagged on the edge of the table. It slipped off her hand before she could stop it. She froze, terrified, her bare skin exposed. He noticed and raised an eyebrow. You're always wearing gloves, he said. She nodded quickly, stuffing her hand back into the glove. You don't have to tell me, he said gently, but you don't have to be scared, either. For reasons she couldn't explain, she believed him. They started talking more after that. Slowly, carefully, she let him into her life. He never pushed for too much, never asked questions she wasn't ready to answer, and for the first time in her life, she felt almost normal. But the fear never fully went away. She knew what she was, what she could do. She would never let herself forget. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. They were walking through the park, the sky heavy with clouds. It was late autumn, the wind biting at their faces. She stumbled on a loose stone, her glove slipping off again as she tried to catch herself. He caught her hand before she hit the ground. Bare skin on bare skin. She gasped, waiting for the inevitable, the cold, the stiffness, the stillness that always followed. But nothing happened. He held her hand firmly, helping her back to her feet. His skin was warm against hers, warm, alive. She stared at him, wide-eyed, waiting for him to collapse, for his body to go rigid, but he just smiled. You're okay, he said softly. She couldn't speak. Her heart was racing, her mind spinning. He was alive. He was alive. For the first time in her life, her touch hadn't brought death. The realization hit her like a wave, crashing over her with such force she could barely breathe. He was alive, and if he was alive, then maybe, just maybe, she wasn't cursed after all. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she squeezed his hand tighter, afraid to let go. He didn't let go, either. That day, everything changed. She finally found a reason to believe that there was more to her life than fear and isolation. And in the warmth of his hand, she found something she never thought she would: hope. Nadia stood at the edge of the town, alone, watching the world pass her by from a distance. She had lived like this for years, isolated, hidden, silent. She wasn't born like this. It happened when she was 16. A fever so intense it nearly killed her left her changed forever. After that, anyone who touched her skin collapsed within seconds, their bodies stiff, breathless, lifeless. At first, they called it a tragedy, a freak accident. Then it happened again, and again. Doctors couldn't explain it. No virus, no toxin, no reason at all. People simply froze in place, their bodies turning rigid and cold, as if death had reached out from her fingertips. It was as if her touch drained the very life from them. The town grew afraid of her. Rumors spread faster than fire in dry grass. Whispers in markets, fingers pointed at shadows. Her family tried to protect her, but even they grew distant. She understood. One slip, one moment of contact, and it would be over for them too. So she left before that could happen. She disappeared into the woods on the edge of town, building a life in a small cabin, away from everything and everyone. She survived off the land, gathering what she could from the forest, hunting when necessary. It was a lonely life, but it was better than being feared, better than hurting anyone else. Years passed. Nadia grew tougher, stronger, but always alone. She avoided trails, avoided people. Even when she had to go into town for supplies, she wrapped herself in gloves and thick clothing, covering every inch of her skin. People avoided her, and she was grateful for it. She didn't want to be noticed. She didn't want to be known. It was safer that way. Until the day she met him. She was hauling a sack of supplies back from town when she slipped on a patch of ice. The ground came up fast, her knee smashing hard into the frozen dirt, and the sack of supplies rolled down the hill. Cans and packets spilled out everywhere. She cursed under her breath, trying to get up, her knee throbbing with pain. She didn't see him approach until he was right there, crouching beside her. "You okay?" His voice was calm, steady. He had dark hair and rough hands, the kind that belonged to someone who worked hard for a living. Before she could warn him, he reached out to help her up. His hand wrapped around her arm. She froze. Not him. Her breath caught in her throat, waiting for the familiar collapse, the stiffening, the sudden end. But it didn't come. His grip stayed warm and firm, his eyes steady on hers. "You're hurt," he said, helping her to her feet. "Let me carry that." She didn't speak. She couldn't. She just nodded, stunned, and watched as he gathered her scattered supplies and hefted the sack onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing. They walked in silence back to her cabin. Her thoughts raced the entire time. How was he still alive? Why hadn't her touch affected him? Was he different somehow? Immune? She kept glancing at him, half expecting him to drop dead at any second. But he didn't. At the cabin, he set the sack down by the door. "You should be more careful," he said with a small smile. Then he turned and walked back toward the woods, disappearing into the trees. Nadia stared after him for a long time. Her heart was still pounding, but for the first time in years, it wasn't from fear. It was something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The next day, she went back to the same spot where she had fallen. She waited, unsure if he would come back. Hours passed, and just when she was about to give up, he appeared again, carrying firewood on his shoulder. They didn't speak much at first. He introduced himself, Daniel. He lived in a small cabin not far from hers. He'd moved to the area recently, looking for a quieter life after working in the city for too long. He didn't ask why she lived alone. He didn't pry. He just helped her with small things, carrying wood, fixing the roof of her cabin, bringing her fresh vegetables from his garden. Days turned into weeks. Nadia found herself looking forward to his visits. He never stayed too long, always leaving just when the air grew too heavy with unspoken questions. But each time he left, she felt a little less alone. One cold morning, as frost clung to the trees and the air smelled of pine, she stood by the door, waiting for him. When he arrived, she did something she hadn't done in years. She reached out her hand. No gloves. No barrier. He looked at her, then down at her hand. Slowly, he reached out and took it in his. Warm. Steady. Alive. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't pull away. For the first time in years, she felt human again. Not a monster. Not a curse. Just a person, standing in the cold, holding the hand of another person. In that moment, everything changed. The fear that had gripped her for so long began to loosen its hold. Maybe, just maybe, her touch wasn't a death sentence for everyone. Maybe there was more to her story than isolation and fear. And for the first time in years, Nadia believed it. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. He didn't need to say anything. He stayed, and that was enough. It was late November, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones and refuses to leave. Sophia had learned long ago that her touch was deadly, not metaphorically, literally. It started when she was a child, though no one could explain it. Doctors ran tests. Specialists from across the country examined her, but the answer never came. No disease, no poison in her blood. But anyone who touched her skin would die, their bodies freezing solid within seconds. Her parents had tried to protect her at first. They wrapped her in layers of clothing, made sure she never touched anyone, and kept her isolated. But fear grew in their eyes, and fear became distance. Then one day, they were gone. She woke up alone in the house, a note left on the kitchen table telling her it was for the best. She was 16. She didn't cry. What was the point? Since then, she had lived on the edge of society, constantly covered in gloves, scarves, and long-sleeved shirts. She moved from town to town, never staying long enough to be noticed. She avoided crowds, worked odd jobs at night, and lived in small, forgotten apartments, always alone, always careful. She learned how to survive in silence, how to watch people from a distance, how to live without truly living. Years passed like this. Sophia became a ghost among the living, invisible by choice. She got used to the hollow feeling in her chest, the heavy weight of solitude. She stopped dreaming of anything else. She was a danger to the world, and the world was dangerous to her. Then she met him. It was an accident, like most important things are. The snow had started falling early that year, and the streets were icy. She was walking home from a late shift at a warehouse when she heard the sound of tires skidding. She turned just in time to see the truck spinning toward the man. He didn't see it coming. He was carrying a grocery bag, his head down to shield himself from the wind. Sophia didn't think. She ran, closing the distance between them in seconds. Her hand shot out, grabbing his arm and yanking him back just before the truck slid past, missing them by inches. The grocery bag hit the ground, oranges rolling into the street. The man stared at her, wide-eyed. She froze. Her hand was still on his arm. His skin, direct contact. She waited for it to happen, the familiar tightening, the sudden stillness, the ice spreading through his veins. She'd seen it so many times before. It always happened fast, too fast to stop. But nothing happened. He blinked at her, confused but alive, his breath visible in the cold air, his pulse steady beneath her fingers. Sophia pulled her hand back like she'd been burned. Her heart was racing, her chest tight with panic. She backed away, waiting for the collapse, waiting for him to freeze and fall. Still, nothing happened. "You okay?" he asked, his voice steady, calm. She nodded, unable to speak. Then she turned and walked away as quickly as she could without running. 4 days. Sophia couldn't stop thinking about it. She replayed the moment in her head over and over, trying to make sense of it. She had touched him, she was sure of it, his skin against hers. There was no mistake. And yet, he lived. He walked away. It wasn't possible, but it happened. She started watching for him after that, standing at the edge of the park where she'd first seen him. Days passed before she spotted him again, sitting on a bench with a coffee in his hand. He seemed normal, ordinary. Nothing about him explained why her touch hadn't harmed him. She followed him from a distance, not sure what she was looking for. He worked at a small repair shop, fixing cars and chatting with customers. He smiled easily, laughed often. There was nothing strange about him at all. Sophia couldn't understand it, but part of her didn't care. For the first time in years, she felt something other than fear and loneliness. She felt curious. One night, she found herself standing outside the repair shop after closing. The lights were off, the street quiet. She stood there for a long time before she worked up the courage to knock on the door. He answered, surprised but not alarmed. "I need to know something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I touch your hand?" He hesitated for a moment, then held out his hand. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his skin. Warm, alive. Tears welled in her eyes. She hadn't touched another person without causing pain in over a decade. She hadn't felt human warmth, real connection. Now it was here, right in front of her. He didn't pull away. Neither did she. For the first time in her life, she felt something break open inside her, a wall she hadn't realized was there. The weight she had carried for so long began to lift. Slowly but surely, she was no longer a danger to everyone. She wasn't a curse. She was just a woman, and for the first time, she believed she could have a life that wasn't defined by fear and death. They stayed like that for a long time, standing in the quiet street, her hand in his. For Sophia, it was the beginning of something new, something she never thought she'd have: hope.